The Eighth Army that prepared to attack at El Alamein in October 1942 was not the same army that had reeled back from Tobruk 4 months earlier. It had been reinforced, reorganized, trained, supplied, and psychologically steadied until it became something larger than the sum of its tanks and battalions. Montgomery did not create this strength from nothing, and the men who had stopped Rommel in July deserve their full place in the story. Yet under his command, the army was shaped for a specific purpose: to fight a deliberate battle against a fortified Axis line and keep fighting until that line broke. This episode matters because it explains the foundation beneath the famous victory. El Alamein was not won by inspiration alone. It was won by an army painstakingly rebuilt for one decisive offensive.
If you would like to move beyond the podcast, you can see my available books at militaryauthor.me. And at trackpads.com, you will find magazines and galleries with hundreds of thousands of photos and videos to explore.
The Eighth Army was multinational in the fullest sense. It included British formations, but also Australians, New Zealanders, South Africans, Indians, and other troops whose experience and sacrifices were central to the campaign. These were not decorative names in an imperial order of battle. They held ground, attacked ridges, cleared mines, endured bombardment, and fought in the close infantry battles that made armored movement possible. The Desert War often produces images of tanks racing across open spaces, but at El Alamein, infantry from across the Commonwealth and Empire carried much of the burden at the start. They were the ones who would step into darkness, move through gaps in wire and mines, and seize objectives that tanks could not safely reach first. The Army's armored force had also changed. American-built Shermans and Grants gave the Eighth Army better firepower and reliability than it had enjoyed in some earlier desert battles. British tanks remained in service as well, and the result was a mixed armored force rather than a single perfect instrument. But the key improvement was not merely the arrival of new models. It was the ability to assemble enough serviceable tanks, train their crews, plan their movement, and support them with fuel, ammunition, recovery, and repair. A tank count on paper can mislead if half the machines are broken, short of spares, or committed in the wrong way. Montgomery's army needed tanks that could enter battle as part of a prepared system and remain useful after the first day. Artillery was one of the great pillars of that system. The Eighth Army concentrated guns on a scale that made the opening barrage possible and allowed repeated fire support throughout the battle. Artillery in this context was not just noise before the real action. It suppressed enemy positions, disrupted communications, covered infantry movement, broke up counterattacks, and helped compensate for the dangers of minefields and anti-tank guns. Good artillery also required its own logistics: shells, tractors, observation posts, survey work, communications lines, and trained fire controllers. A gun without ammunition or a target is only metal. At El Alamein, artillery became a continuous tool of battle because the army behind it had prepared the means to keep it firing. Engineers were just as essential, though their work has often received less popular attention. The Axis minefields were deep, irregular, and dangerous, forming what soldiers called the Devil's Gardens. Before armor could exploit, engineers had to find mines, lift mines, mark lanes, repair routes, and keep traffic from collapsing into chaos. This was slow, exposed, nerve-wearing work, often done at night and under fire. The success of the offensive depended on whether those lanes could be opened and kept open. That fact alone should change how we imagine a tank battle. At El Alamein, the tank's future path was often created first by men on foot, moving carefully through darkness with detectors, probes, tape, and markers. The Desert Air Force strengthened the army in another way. By October, Allied air superiority over the battlefield and the wider supply routes had become an important advantage. Aircraft could attack Axis movement, strike supply columns, interfere with airfields, and provide reconnaissance. They did not remove the need for infantry to fight through minefields or for tanks to face anti-tank guns, but they made Rommel's situation harder every day. The Axis army was already struggling with fuel and replacements, and air attack magnified those weaknesses. For Montgomery, air power was not a separate drama above the desert. It was part of the same battle system, shaping when enemy reserves could move and how much supply could reach them. The logistical base behind the Eighth Army may have been its most decisive advantage. Men at the front saw shells, petrol tins, rations, water, spare parts, medical supplies, and replacement vehicles arrive because an enormous rear area organization made them arrive. Railways, roads, depots, workshops, truck columns, ports, and administrative staffs turned distant industrial power into usable battlefield strength. This was not glamorous work, but it was the condition for everything else. Montgomery could plan a long, set-piece battle because his army had the resources to sustain one. Rommel, by contrast, had to husband fuel and equipment under far harsher constraints. In armored warfare, the line between tactical courage and operational possibility often runs through the supply dump. Training turned material into method. The Eighth Army used the weeks before the battle to rehearse minefield procedures, night movement, artillery coordination, infantry objectives, traffic control, and the passage of armor through cleared lanes. Rehearsal could not eliminate fear or confusion, and no exercise could fully reproduce the violence of the battlefield. Still, it gave units a shared language and a sequence of expected actions. That mattered because earlier battles had shown what happened when infantry, tanks, and guns worked to different rhythms. A unit that understands not only its own task, but the task of the unit beside it, is more likely to recover when the plan begins to fray. Montgomery's army was being trained to endure friction rather than collapse under it.
Command structure and morale were also part of the rebuilding. Montgomery simplified expectations and made clear that the army would fight from the El Alamein line rather than retreat. He visited formations, projected confidence, and insisted on preparation before action. His style could be theatrical and self-promoting, but it had a practical effect on an army tired of reverses. Soldiers needed to believe that the coming offensive had been thought through. They needed to feel that their commanders were not going to throw armor forward blindly or abandon infantry after an initial success. Morale in this sense was not just emotional uplift, it was trust in the plan, trust in preparation, and trust that sacrifice would serve a coherent purpose.
The opposition facing this rebuilt army remained formidable. German and Italian forces had dug themselves into deep defensive belts, protected by mines, wire, artillery, and anti-tank guns. Rommel's reputation was real, built on victories that had humiliated British command more than once. His army included experienced German formations and Italian units that often fought under difficult and unfairly remembered conditions. The Eighth Army could not simply assume that weight of numbers would sweep such defenders away. Even a weaker Axis force could inflict heavy losses if British armor became trapped in minefields or if infantry attacks stalled short of their objectives. The army Montgomery built therefore had to be strong enough not only to attack, but to absorb disappointment and continue. That ability to continue was central to the coming battle. Second El Alamein was not going to be a single blow followed by instant pursuit. The plan might hope for a breakthrough, but the battlefield was too dense and the Axis defense too prepared for certainty. The Eighth Army needed reserves, ammunition, fresh formations, replacement tanks, and a command system able to shift pressure without losing control. In earlier desert warfare, a failed attack could produce a rapid swing in initiative. Montgomery wanted a battle in which failure in one place did not mean failure everywhere. The rebuilt army was designed to keep applying force, to grind, adjust, and then strike again when the enemy had been weakened.
There is a temptation to see Montgomery's army simply as an army of abundance, overwhelming a smaller opponent by weight. That view contains part of the truth, but misses the more important point. Material superiority mattered enormously, and it would be dishonest to pretend otherwise. But material superiority has to be organized to become victory. Tanks must be serviceable, artillery supplied, infantry rested, engineers prepared, and commanders clear about priorities. The Eighth Army had possessed strength before and still suffered defeats when that strength was badly used. In October 1942, the difference was that strength had been concentrated inside a method. The army was not merely larger, it was more deliberately assembled for the specific battlefield it had to break.
The army Montgomery built also points forward in the history of armored warfare. Later mechanized operations, from the campaigns in Northwest Europe to the high-tempo armored battles of the late 20th century, would depend on the same broad principles: combined arms, secure supply, communications, air-ground cooperation, maintenance, and disciplined command. El Alamein was not as fast or fluid as later armored breakthroughs, and its opening phase was more siege-like than romantic. But that is precisely why it teaches so much. It shows that modern armored victory often begins long before the tanks race forward. It begins when an army creates the conditions under which movement can happen without being destroyed at the first obstacle.
By October, the Eighth Army had become a weapon built for a particular task. Its infantry would open the fight. Its engineers would carve lanes through mines. Its artillery would pound and suppress. Its air forces would isolate and harass. And its armor would seek the moment when a break-in could become a breakthrough. Nothing about that task was easy, and nothing about the coming victory was automatic. But the battered force that had once retreated across the desert now possessed depth, confidence, and a plan. That is why El Alamein stands as more than a famous tank battle. It was the moment when survival was turned into preparation, and preparation into a battlefield method powerful enough to break Rommel's line.
You've been listening to Famous Tank Battles. These battles were never just about machines. They were about doctrine, terrain, firepower, logistics, and the hard problem of turning shock into victory. For more military history writing and books, visit militaryauthor.me. And for magazines, podcasts, and a massive archive of military photos and video, visit trackpads.com. Thanks for listening.